what I would also wish to put on record is that, when I go to speak at refresher courses, it is almost always the case that I would not have the chance to speak to as many participants of the refresher course as possible, because for whatever reason, it becomes difficult to speak to each and every one of them. But I will never forget the refresher course at North Bengal University, where I had the opportunity to make the acquaintance of Webu, because our interactions spilled outside the classroom as well. And I think that is something that I cherish. That is the memory that I hold very dear. And I hope that many of the persons who are participating today are going to continue sort of interacting with me in that spirit. I noticed Jill's here somewhere. Jill's had earlier organized a webinar at which I spoke. So Jill's, very nice to see you again. And greetings to everybody who is present here today. Now, what I wish to talk about is basically about the way in which masculinity is represented. So although when I began interacting with your college, I was told that it would be interesting to sort of focus on the performativity of masculinity and the body, because apparently you already run a course on performance studies and on the body and on body studies, if I'm not mistaken. So I was specifically asked to address performance. I was specifically asked to address the body in my discussion of masculinity. And that is something that I have kept in mind. But what I added to it also is the visual representation of masculinity. That is something which I have also taken care to sort of include. Now, the PowerPoint presentation that I'm going to use today, the content of it was actually produced quite some time ago. But the PowerPoint that I'm going to present for you today is going to give you a general idea as to how I regard masculinity studies in the context of its visual representation. So I'll be using visual representations to talk about masculinity, and towards the end of my presentation, what I hope to do is something that I'm already telling you at the beginning, which is that maybe, and I think this is where I'm always indebted to the transgender studies, because I think transgender studies have provided a very, very important and a very radical kind of challenge to masculinity studies, a radical intervention to masculinity studies, in the sense that what the transgender studies the scholars do is to say that can we assume, and I think that is a very crucial question that I am going to come to in the course of my discussion, is that can we assume that masculinity is only attached to the body that was designated male at birth? Which is a very crucial question, and I think that is the crucial question which I hope to address as my presentation continues. But can we just keep that in mind right at the very beginning, that when we talk about masculinity, or when we talk about masculinity studies, we should perhaps be careful, and I cannot stress this enough, we should perhaps be careful not to assume that masculinity is or can only be performed by those bodies that are designated male at birth. So if we can just keep that in mind, this is going to be a very basic question, and I will continue to build on that question as my presentation continues. Now, mind you that this particular question arises fairly late in gender studies, yes? Because if we think about gender studies as a discipline, then obviously many of you who have done feminism, who have done gender studies will already know that when we talk about gender studies, we are basically, most of us tend to start with Mary Wollstonecraft. We talk about John Stuart Mill. So that is where we usually begin our discussion of gender studies. Then we skip a few centuries, and then we come to Simone de Beauvoir. And then, of course, we go through the three waves of feminism, right? That is the way in which we normally imagine the history of gender studies, as it were, completely organically linked to feminism, of course. And then what we really find is that around the 1970s, or to be even more specific, towards the 1980s, we have the gradual consolidation of masculinity studies. That begins to happen, led, of course, it goes without saying, by R.W. Connell, who used to be Robert Connell, but now is Raewyn Connell. So Raewyn Connell is a trans woman. And I think if you can just keep that in mind also, if you can just keep that information in mind, that one of the most important contributors to masculinity studies is somebody who is now a trans woman, that I think is going to provide us with a very, very crucial clue as to how masculinity studies can be looked at, and from what angle, from what kind of gendered position, from what kind of sexual position, from what kind of racial, ethnic position can masculinity studies be looked at. So if we can also keep that in mind when we are continuing with our conversation. But it is in the 1990s that we see a very, very important transformation that actually happens in the field of masculinity studies, where not only do we have Judith Butler coming out with Gender Trouble, as you very well know, everybody does, but we also have some very important other theorists who are making radical interventions in masculinity studies, or indeed gender studies in particular. And of course, the name that I would want to particularly flag at this point is Susan Stryker. Those of you who are already subscribed to my YouTube channel, which is there as Niladri R. Chatterjee, you will know that I have already spoken on Susan B. Stryker's very, very crucial essay, Words, I think it's called Words Spoken to Victor Frankenstein Above the Village of Chamonix, which is a very crucial essay as far as our conceptualizing of transgender studies. Now, Susan B. Stryker is another name that I have to mention, because just like Raewyn Connell, who is a trans woman, Susan B. Stryker is also a trans woman. So two of the most important names in masculinity studies are trans women. And I think that this is something which we really need to keep in mind, because when Susan B. Stryker is talking about herself, she is certainly talking about being a trans woman. So it may not have a direct link with masculinity studies, but there is an organic and a basic similarity between what Susan Stryker is saying and what Raewyn Connell is saying, which is that gender is constructed. Gender is constructed, and how the construction of that gender runs sometimes counter to the way in which patriarchy constructs gender. So therefore, gender construction can happen in at least two ways. I'm sure there are more than two ways, but gender construction can broadly happen in two ways. One is the gender construction that is made by patriarchy for you. And on the other hand, you can have a gender construction that you make. So you take charge of your own gender, and you say, this is the way in which I wish to construct my gender, irrespective of what patriarchy thinks. Now, how the patriarchal construction of gender happens, and how in particular the patriarchal construction of masculinity happens, that is something which I am going to explicate with the help of this particular PowerPoint. So, Lijin, if we can have the first slide, then I think we would be able to understand exactly how that construction is happening. Because in the first slide, we see the statue. Now, these kind of Greek statues, and they are very, very common, called the kouros. Now, kouros in Greek basically just means young man. It just means young man. And the kouros, now the picture of the kouros that I'm showing you, this of course dates from 1513 BC. But what I would want you to do is look at the statue very, very carefully. Now, these kouros statues, they are meant, they could have been meant for other purposes, but they could also be used as for decorative purposes, right? So if we now remember that exactly what is this statue telling us? What is the message? What is the anatomical message that the statue is giving us? And is the message just an anatomic one? So those are the two questions that I wish to address. First, when we think about the hegemonic male today, at least the way in which the most dominant kind of Indian film industry is concerned, which is the film industry that is based in Mumbai. Now, there a certain kind of hegemonic masculinity has been steadily growing again since the 1990s. So, and which sort of becomes even more consolidated in the 21st century, because I think Kaho Na Pyar Hai releases in 2000. And then, of course, you've got other male actors who are coming in. So you've got, not only do you have Hrithik Roshan, but you've got Salman Khan. You've got, there are other artists that I'm not going to mention now. I'll mention them later. Now, there you have a kind of masculinity which is presented and promoted and consolidated, circulated and consumed, which is the gym-built body, right? So therefore, enormous biceps, enormous triceps, six-pack abs, massive pectoral muscles. Now, when you compare that kind of masculinity to the masculinity of the kouros, you will very clearly see where the difference lies, because kouros, the statue of the kouros does not have enormous biceps, enormous triceps. If one looks at the kouros statue, you will find that what is actually the statue doing is that it is giving you a male body that is, and this is the crucial point, very, very crucial point, it is a fit male body, not an overly muscular male body. That is a point that I think we really need to keep in mind. The body is fit rather than overtly muscular. But you are going to say, oh, sir, but a muscular body is also a fit body. Maybe not, because some of you will be interested, and if you have friends who go to the gym, yes, those who go to the gym, and those who have enormous biceps and triceps, if you ask them, they are going to tell you something very interesting, which is that when a man has got enormous arms, like huge biceps and huge triceps and all of that, when they bathe, for example, they cannot reach their backs with their arms. They can't do that because the arm is not going to go all the way to the back the way in which my arm is going. It is going to get stuck over here somewhere, because they have got such heavily built muscles that they are simply not going to go beyond a certain point. So do you realize that these enormous muscles, they are actually, contrary to how people think about the hugely muscled guy as being very powerful, do you realize that this heavy musculature is producing a kind of disability? I would want you to keep that in mind. So the enormously muscled guy, somebody who looks like the Hulk, um, looks very, very powerful. But imagine the extent of his power that he also cannot reach certain parts of his own body. So that creates a kind of disability, which is something that people don't acknowledge. Now, in this Kuro statue, this person, with the size of the arms that he has, he can easily reach his back. He will have no problems reaching his back. So, fitness rather than excessive musculature, that is the point that I'm trying to stress over here. Also, is this only about physical fitness, which is the other crucial point? Now, this is not just about physical fitness, because those of you who are familiar with Greek history, with Greek concept of gender, will be aware of the fact that what is actually happening there is that this particularly well-proportioned body, not heavily muscled body, is actually not about the body at all. It isn't about the body at all. It is actually about the mind. Now, this particular idea is something that also carries over into Roman times, into ancient Roman times, because during Roman civilization, you also have the saying, which in Latin, which has come down to us. So we all know that now: mens sana in corpore sano, which basically means that healthy mind in a healthy body, right? So therefore, we know that now. So therefore, healthy mind in a healthy body. So therefore, when people are actually creating a fit body, they are not creating a fit body because a fit body looks good in a tight t-shirt. They are creating a fit body because for them, the fit body is the indication of a fit mind. Mens sana in corpore sano. So what we are looking at, when we are seeing the statue of the Kuros, is not so much a fit body, but a fit mind. And this is where something else begins to happen, which is that because the fit body is being associated with the fit mind, and because the fit body is belonging to the man, so therefore, what is happening is that masculinity is becoming associated with the mind. I would want you to keep that in mind. So, pun intended. So therefore, what is really happening there is that the fit body is becoming two things. One, the fit body is therefore becoming the male body, and the fit body is becoming the male mind. So then fitness is automatically being associated with the masculine. And the body is therefore being equated with the mind. So then what is happening is that women then are basically becoming, by definition, unfit. I hope you understand where I'm going with this. So therefore, when we talk about ancient Greek civilization, let us then try to understand the very insidious way, the very sort of subcutaneous way in which patriarchy is operating in ancient Greece. So the way in which patriarchy is operating in ancient Greece is that therefore fitness and mind are being conflated with the masculine. So therefore the feminine is therefore becoming all about the body, and the feminine is becoming all about unfitness. So that kind of binary is something that we perhaps should keep in mind. Okay, now I am going to jump about 1000 years. Yeah. Well, actually, about 2000 years, I think. Yeah, because this is happening in the 1500, right? So therefore, I'm going to jump 2000 years because we are now going to go into the Renaissance. And Lijin, if we can now have the next slide, please. So in the next slide, we are going to see a very, very famous artwork. This particular artwork, many of you will already recognize because it is done by Leonardo da Vinci. This is the Vitruvian Man. So Lijin, if we can have the next slide, that of the Vitruvian Man. So in the case of the Vitruvian Man, what we are seeing is that, look at the way in which, now this is something that you all know, is that what was happening during the Renaissance, that is to say in early 16th century, is that there was a revival of classical learning. You all know that. So during the Renaissance, there was a revival of classical learning. And because there was a revival of classical learning, there was also a revival of classical representational politics. That is something that we have to keep in mind, right? So although Leonardo da Vinci is producing the Vitruvian Man in 1490, and of course later on we are going to have somebody who Leonardo da Vinci actually regarded not without some justification as his rival, Michelangelo. And we shall of course come to Michelangelo later. But the reason why I would want you to look at the Vitruvian Man in particular is because what is happening in the case of the Vitruvian Man is, look at the way in which Leonardo da Vinci is using supposedly a human body to make a point about sort of, geometric design, to make a point about proportion, yes, to make all of these points. But again, same problem. The body that is being used is clearly gendered male. So then what is happening is that, again, the male body is becoming the human body. That is the crucial point. If the male body becomes the human body, then what is really happening is that the bodies that are not male, do you see where this is going? The body that is not male is then becoming not human. I think you know where I'm going with this. So what is really happening then is that the female body does not have the same human rights as the male body. That is the crucial point that I'm trying to make, is that the female body does not have the human rights of the male body. Because in ancient Greece, as you know very well, those of you who have read Aristotle, you will know this from your reading of Aristotle, that even Aristotle did not believe that women deserve the same rights as the free-born Athenian man. So women were basically regarded as having the same rights as a slave. So that was the way in which women were regarded. So therefore, just as slaves were not regarded as worthy of human dignity, women were equally not regarded as being worthy of human dignity. So what basically happens is that the man that is being talked about effectively becomes the free-born Athenian man. So look at the way in which masculinity is not just about the body that is designated male at birth, but masculinity also becomes about race. That is the crucial point. So masculinity also becomes about race. So what we see in the case of Leonardo da Vinci is that when he is producing the Vitruvian Man, he in a very strange way is continuing that same project, that same particular project of actually producing the male body as the human body. That is broadly what is happening, right? And then, of course, Lijin, if you could kindly show us the third slide, then that is also going to make us understand exactly how masculinity is functioning as far as the visual arts is concerned. So how is masculinity being performed, as it were, in the visual representational skill? So the next slide that I'm going to show you, if Lijin can sort of produce the next slide, please. What we shall see in the next slide is this, of course, is where we come to Michelangelo. Many of you will already be familiar with this. This is, of course, not the entire painting. I'm sorry, this is not Michelangelo. This is not Michelangelo. We are going to come to Michelangelo later. But this particular scene, expulsion from the Garden of Eden, which is being produced by an artist whose name escapes me. I'm so sorry. I'll have to call that up soon. I don't know whether it's anyway. I'll come up with the name of this artist. But what I would really want you to see in this particular section of the fresco, which is produced in 1425, is that over here you see Adam and Eve being banished, of course, from the Garden of Eden. This is a story that we are all familiar with. But what we also see very importantly is that till this point, again, 1425, so we already have a certain revival, as it were, of male nudity. The point about the male nudity is something that I should have actually said when I was making the presentation regarding the Kouros. But the male nudity continues, so male nudity was very, very importantly a part of Greek statuary. And of course, a very quick point about nudity in the context of the male body, because in Greek sculpture, what we saw is that why is nudity so important? Now, many of you will know that the word gymnasium, of course, we now pronounce it as gymnasium, but it is actually the correct pronunciation would probably be gymnasium. And in that particular word, gymnasium, gymnos means naked. So therefore, in ancient Greece, young men and boys exercised in the gym naked. As you very well know that the Olympic Games, when it originally began, all the participants had to perform naked. A little different from the way in which people participate in the Olympic Games right now. Also, there used to be two kinds of Olympic Games. One was for men, the other was for women. When women participated in the Olympic Games, they were allowed to wear clothing. But when men participated in the Olympic Games, they were not allowed to wear clothing. So therefore, so then we wonder why. Why is it that nudity is often associated with the male body, but nudity is not very often associated with the female body? And we see this in this particular slide as well, that the artist does not appear to have had any kind of difficulty showing the genitalia of Adam, but of course has hidden the breasts and the vagina of Eve. So why is it that male nudity is of such great concern? It is of such great concern because nudity in ancient Greece, which is of course revived in the 15th and 16th century, male nudity is regarded as the visual representation of perfect human bodily shape. So the perfect human is the naked male. So when you are naked, you are basically exposing your entire body to the public gaze. And when you are exposing your entire body to the public gaze, your anatomical perfection is something that is becoming obvious to the entire public. And again, as I would like to remind you, your anatomical perfection is not just about your anatomy. If you're anatomically perfect, that also means that you are intellectually perfect. So ultimately, it still becomes all about the body. Also, what I would want you to sort of notice in this extraordinary depiction is that Adam is not hiding his genitalia, but he is hiding his face. Eve, on the other hand, is hiding, her breasts and her vagina. So, in this very important painting, what we find is that Adam is hiding the most important part of his identity, the face, that is to say, the head, that is to say, the intellect, and Eve is hiding the most important part of her identity, which is her gender, characterized by the presence of the breasts and the vagina. So, what they are hiding is an indication as to what is the most precious for them. And this particular idea that I'm going to hide what is the most precious, that is something which we find repeated over and over again, because as you very well know, that when we talk about our genitalia, we usually refer to them as our private parts. Yes. Now, whether it is truly our private parts or not is debatable, but that is the discussion that I'll come to much later. Okay. Now, if we move on, Lijin, to the next slide, then we are going to see, wait, yeah. So is that the next slide, or have we missed another one? Could we just go back and see if we have missed a slide? No, okay, that's fine. Yeah, so the codpiece. Now, this again is something which, this is absolutely about the performance of masculinity of real men, because all the performances of masculinity that we have seen so far, they have been of men that are that have been idealized. Yes. So Adam. Nobody has a Facebook picture of Adam. Has anybody seen an Instagram post by Adam? We haven't. So similarly, nobody has seen an Instagram or a Facebook post by a Kuros. So therefore, the men that we have seen so far, neither have we seen anything by the Vitruvian Man. So the men that we have seen so far, they are not historical figures in that sense. But now we come to the historical figures. And here we have three men who actually existed in history. We have got Charles V of France. We've got Henry VIII of England, we know very well. And we have an Italian nobleman called Pedro Maria Rossi. Now, what I would want you to notice over there, I don't know whether it is clear to you or not, but if it isn't clear to you, you can certainly Google these particular portraits and you can see that for yourself. But what we, so Lijin, is it possible to sort of zoom in on the three pictures? Is it possible to do that? So if we zoom in on the pictures, if we have them in a slightly larger size, then maybe I would be able to show, that is perfect. So maybe I would be able to draw your attention to something that is going on at the crotch of these men. Now, what these three men are wearing is something called a codpiece. Now, what is a codpiece? The codpiece is that item of clothing which supposedly hides the penis. Yes, but this is the interesting politics of hiding and revealing. The codpiece is so elaborately decorated. The codpiece is so openly shown because you can actually see the codpiece very, very clearly in the portrait of Charles V. You can see the codpiece that is clearly visible under the waist of Henry VIII, And of course, the codpiece is remarkably visible in the case of Rossi. Now, what the codpiece does is that it reveals and hides at the same time. So it hides the penis, but it also very clearly shows the presence of the penis. So then what really happens is that by the time we come to the Renaissance, an item of clothing becomes crucial to the performance and to the visual representation of masculinity, is that you are going to wear an item of clothing that is actually going to draw attention to the fact that you have a penis. Now, this idea that you have a penis, this is something, so why is that necessary? Because by that time, the politics of clothing, the politics of performing a kind of hegemonic masculinity was all about showing that you actually had the penis. So therefore, the penis in a very strange way becomes the site of power. The penis becomes the site of authority. And of course, the penis is obviously regarded as a site for masculinity. And I'm saying this with a lot of irony because later on I'm going to complicate our understanding of whether penis actually is an indicator of masculinity at all. Okay, so now we move on to the next slide, Lijin, if it is possible. So we move on to the next slide, and now we come very, very quickly to Dara Singh. So we are coming, in a huge jump. We are coming to 1960s, and we are coming to 1960s India. Now, the reason why I'm using this particular slide, this particular poster of Dara Singh, is to show how masculinity functions in India. Now, this is where I would want to thank you, Lijin, for zooming in on the image. Thank you so much. So that people can have a slightly better view as to how Dara Singh is working. Now, see that I would want you to look at this image of Dara Singh, and I would want you to compare it with the image of the Kuros that we have seen. Dara Singh is exposing a very large part of his body. The Kuros is entirely naked. The Kuros does not have a heavily muscled body. Dara Singh, as you can tell, is enormously, almost grotesquely muscled. Now, what is this doing? So therefore, between the 15th and the 20th century, what begins to happen is that the representation of the male body changes very, very radically. So what happens is that previously, do you see that the male body was not about the body, but it was about the mind. But now the male body also remains about the mind, because you see, when Dara Singh is pictured like this, Dara Singh is not pictured as a sex object. He is still not somebody who is regarded as sexy. He is still not somebody who is regarded as hot. He is simply regarded as somebody who is enormously powerful. So there is a way in which the representation of Dara Singh is again continuing the ancient Greek conflation of the body with the mind, because Dara Singh's body is supposed to represent power, valor, courage, strength, bravery, and of course enormous capacity for violence. And look at the way in which Hercules is sort of presented, and you have the lady who is sitting sort of almost genuflecting. That I think is remarkable, because you have a very, very overtly gendered representation of masculinity and femininity that is happening over here. So the female as the supplicant, as the weak, as the genuflecting, as somebody who looks up to masculinity, and masculinity as somebody who is actually, looking down on femininity. And I think that is remarkable. I'm wondering if that big face at the background I'm wondering if that isn't patriarchy. So what is really going on then in this extraordinary poster from early 1960s is that you have certain ways of representing masculinity, performing masculinity, that is changing. So masculinity is becoming more and more muscular, more and more capable of violence. But in certain ways, it is not changing, because masculinity is still occupying, or the male body is still occupying, the subject position. It still does not remain an object until something happens. And now we move on to the next slide. Because what happens in the next slide, I think, is something that we are all going to recognize, because this is all within our living memory. And so there you have it. You have got John Abraham. This, of course, is a very, very famous image from Dostana from 2008. And what we really have there is, for the very first time in history, the male body becomes the object rather than the subject. So what really happens in the 21st century, and of course, I have spoken elsewhere that the objectification of the male body happens to a very, very large extent due to something that happens in the 1950s. Because in the 1950s, what we have is, in America, you have the production of these bodybuilding magazines, supposedly bodybuilding magazines, which are called physique pictorials. Late 1950s. Now, what these physique pictorials do is that these physique pictorials are supposedly about people who are interested in bodybuilding. But the physique pictorial has got an entirely different kind of readership, because the physique pictorials are bought by gay men in the 1950s, right? So therefore, it is the gay men who buy these bodybuilding magazines, because these bodybuilding magazines are full of pictures of men, heavily muscled, heavily oiled, standing around in posing pouches. So what begins to happen from the 1950s onwards in America, not so much in India, what begins to happen from the 1950s onwards is that the representation of the male body begins to become more and more and more objectified. And this continues to happen, and it becomes even more of a phenomenon, of a cultural phenomenon, in the 1980s, when you have people like Bruce Weber, when you have people like Robert Mapplethorpe, when you have people like Herb Ritts. They are all photographers, and they're all producing these extraordinary images of men not as the subject, but men as the object. But in India, many of you will say, but oh, sir, but John A. Abraham was not the first one. Before John Abraham, we had, some may say, Dharmendra. But others, we are going to say, no, sir, but not just John Abraham. Why are you forgetting somebody like Milind Soman? Yes, of course, Milind Soman was there before John Abraham, but the kind of cultural reach that John Abraham had, that kind of cultural reach, I don't think Milind Soman ever had. So therefore, what we are actually looking at then in the 21st century is that the performance of masculinity is becoming more and more objectified. And what is interesting, is that this kind of objectification is something that a lot of men are actually consuming, they are internalizing, they are performing, and they are circulating. So therefore, now when men join the gym, most men, they are going to say that, oh, I am joining the gym, I am not interested in having big muscles. Yeah, you've heard your friends say that, I'm not interested in having big muscles, I'm only interested in being fit. Okay, but you're only interested in being fit, but then if you're only interested in being fit, then why do you always take a selfie of yourself in the gym mirror after you have worked out for 2 minutes? Yeah, you lift weights for 2 minutes and immediately your camera comes out. Oh, let's see how much muscle I have. So therefore, men are lying over here. They are saying that on the one hand, I am joining the gym only to keep fit, but at the same time, if they've worked out for 5 minutes, they're immediately going to take a picture of themselves. Why? Because they are now objectifying themselves. Self-objectification. In a visual age where our identities are not worth anything, unless we have constant representations of ourselves on Facebook, constant representations of ourselves on Instagram. I myself am, of course, partly guilty of that. Our identities somehow are not validated. And this is something that used to be the case with women once upon a time, but now it is absolutely pervasive among men too. Okay, now, Lijin, if we can move very quickly to the next slide. So if we can move on to the next slide, then I think there's a bit of a video lag, so I am not able to see the next slide. But anyway, so while the next slide comes up, I think what I would want us to do is to, yeah, okay, fantastic. So now we have, so then what happens to masculinity when that masculinity is actually the male body is performing the feminine? What happens to masculinity then? Now, this is where I would want to refer to Chapal Bhaduri. This particular actor is somebody who is personally known to me. And when I and the late Professor Tutun Mukherjee, when we edited Nari Bhav, we actually put him on the cover. Once the question answer session starts, I will be able to show you the book so that you can see exactly how we have used him for the cover. He himself is very, very happy with it. He's very proud of it. But what I would really want to do is that is the male body, does the male body therefore always have to perform a certain kind of masculinity? Because Chapal Bhaduri, when he was actively doing theater, he used to do a lot of folk theater, which in Bengal is called Jatra. Now, when you're doing Jatra, when Chapal Bhaduri was doing Jatra, he was performing the role of a goddess called Monosha. So therefore, remember, so therefore, how many boundaries is he crossing? He is crossing the boundary of human to divine, but he is also crossing the boundary of male to female. So there are at least two boundaries that he is crossing. And so therefore, what really begins to happen is that we understand that masculinity need not be predicated on the body that has the penis, and similarly, femininity need not be predicated on the body that has a vagina. So therefore, you can have a penis and perform femininity. You can have the vagina and perform masculinity. So I think that is something that we really need to keep in mind. Moving on to the next slide, Lijin. So what I'm going to show in the next slide then is something which is, again, the way in which, so this particular gentleman, Eddie Izzard, he is a British comedian, and Eddie Izzard is an advocate, or at least he used to be an advocate, for equal clothing rights, because he believed that men should have the liberty to dress the way they want. So therefore, he is wearing nail varnish, he is wearing eyeshadow, and in a very strange way, he has used his hands to mimic the pistol that James Bond is supposed to be holding. Now, James Bond, of course, as we very well know, is famous for performing masculinity, right? In the West, or British masculinity of a certain kind is almost exclusively performed by somebody like James Bond, who, of course, is not a real figure. He's a fictional creation. But when Eddie Izzard is positioning his nail-varnished fingers in the shape of a pistol, he is doing something very, very subversive. He is he's referencing masculinity, because the pistol is regarded as a phallic, supposedly as a phallic object, but he is mimicking that phallic object by using hands that are also referencing femininity. So therefore, there is a certain kind of messiness that he is creating, right? So he is actually confusing masculinity and femininity, and I think it is this confusion which is very, very productive. It is, I believe, extremely progressive, and this is something that it's a word that I haven't used so far, which is queer. So this is queering. That is what is happening. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, then I think I'm coming to the end of my presentation right now. So if we move on to the next slide, then we are going to see what happens to the male body which is disabled. Because if patriarchy constantly presents us as the male body being the abled body, then how do we configure the disabled male body? Now, there are two ways in which one can regard the disabled male body. One is to say that, I'm not going to regard it as a male body or a female body. I'm simply going to regard it as a disabled body. So there is one way of looking at it. But there is a way in which patriarchy also appropriates the body of the disabled male through a certain narrative, through a certain kind of discourse of overcoming adversity, right? So therefore, very often what we see in representations of male disability is, oh, look how he overcomes his disability. So this whole overcoming of disability seems to be a consolidation of his masculinity. And so therefore, disability is regarded in some circles as being feminizing. So when you're actually saying that, he has overcome his disability, it is almost as you're saying that, no, isn't it wonderful? He has basically overcome his femininity. Now he's truly a man. And then we very quickly move on to the next slide. If there is one, I'm not terribly sure if there is one. Is there a next slide? Okay. Well, anyway. Okay, this is the last slide. Fantastic. So thank you. So I think, Lijin, you can stop sharing the screen. And so in conclusion, I would simply want to say thank you, Lijin, so much for your cooperation today. What I would really wish to do then is to conclude my presentation by saying that when we are regarding masculinity, we should not just think about masculinity as something that is permanently attached to the body that is designated male at birth, because we also have trans men, which is something that I haven't talked about today. Trans men, and especially the work of Judith Halberstam, becomes very important over here, who is talking about how masculinity is not always the presentation or consolidation of hegemonic patriarchal power, but it can be just a style. It can be just a style without wanting patriarchal dividends. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to getting your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Now the floor is open for interaction. Please feel free to ask your queries to the guest.
You can actually ask questions live, or maybe you can also type the questions in the chat box so that we can read it for you.
Hello, sir. Myself, Shijo George, and
Yes,
I'm a
hello.
second year PG student.
Hello.
And I'd like to ask you what is the difference between a genderless society and a gender neutral society?
Oh, wow.
And could we
Yes.
ever dream of such a society in the future?
Yes, of course, there is a difference between a genderless society and a gender neutral society. Because when we are thinking about a gender neutral society, what we are basically saying is that there are going to be several genders. So we are actually saying that, yes, of course, there are going to be several genders, but we are not going to um, privilege or disempower any particular gender. So a gender neutral society is where gender is acknowledged, but gender is not regarded as being in any way a privilege or a disadvantage. A genderless society is, of course, a society where gender is not acknowledged at all. So therefore, which is my dream society. I do not dream of a gender neutral society. I dream of a genderless society. So where we do not function as gendered beings at all, because what my feminism has taught me is that gender doesn't exist. There is no anatomical base for gender. There is no, I am tired of saying this at 2000 seminars, that biological sex does not exist. There is no such thing as biological sex. Sex is also gender, as Judith Butler has gone blue in the face saying. So therefore, sex is social construct, just as gender is a social construct. So that is the difference between a genderless society and a gender neutral society, Shijo. Thank you for your question.
All right. Thank you so much, sir.
We have some questions in the chat box. I'll just read it out for you, sir.
Yes, please. Thank you.
From Anupam Devnath, masculinity continues to be theorized as something that actively constrains or oppresses men, offers them a set of benefits and privileges. How can we go beyond this?
Oh, I don't think that all of masculinity studies does that, because, of course, a very, very important intervention in masculinity studies is done by trans men. So therefore, people like Jean Bobby Noble, people like Judith Halberstam, as I have just said. I'm sorry, Jack Halberstam. Why do I keep referring to him as Judith? Jack Halberstam. Because they have said that masculinity can be a style. It can simply be a style, and one can perform masculinity without participating in patriarchy. There is a way of doing that. So therefore, and I think feminist trans men, not all trans men, of course, because trans men can also be patriarchal, just as trans women can be patriarchal, but feminist trans men have tried to show that masculinity can simply be a matter of presentation. So therefore, it is like whether you wish to wear a particular color need not in any way denote how you are participating in a structure of oppression. So therefore, I think looking at the work that is being done by trans men helps us to understand that masculinity can be neither oppressive nor empowering. It can simply be a kind of presentation. So that is a major intervention in the realm of masculinity studies.
So I do have a question. Can I ask?
Yes, yes, of course.
So when we talk about masculinity, when we focus particularly on Indian masculinity,
Yes.
so in my opinion, I still believe that India is yet to find a masculinity or quote unquote masculinity of its own. I mean, okay, if you look at Hollywood, through my example, I believe I can express what I mean. Okay, if you look at Hollywood, and nowadays it's dominated by the Hemsworth brothers or Chris Evans or the other Chris's or Benedict Cumberbatch, etc. But
Okay.
when we look at the people that they represent, I think we can find many people who look just like them, or even better than them, quote unquote better than them. But when we look at Bollywood, we find a particular set of actors with a particular set of traits, mostly Europeanized traits. And then we look at the people that they represent. The chances of finding somebody that looks on par with or somebody like Hrithik Roshan is very slim. compared to what we
Yes.
compared to the disparity between the Hollywood celebrities and the people they represent. I think it's mostly because India has not yet found a masculinity of its own to represent the people. Because people who share a similar trait to those Europeanized celebrities, they do have an insanely huge amount of advantage over the other people. So but there are people, or there are cultures who which actually surpass these limitations. I mean, if you look at an emerging industry like K-pop, for example, their idea of masculinity is insanely different from the Western counterpart. But they went with it, confidently went with it, and successfully made the other people accept them for what they are. If you look at people like BTS, for example, they don't have anything in common with their Western counterparts. They don't have a single body hair or facial hair. They're extremely thin, and most importantly, they are heavily criticized, still criticized, even if they are famous. They're heavily criticized for being feminine. But the thing is, in Korean culture, they are not feminine. It's just a part of their culture, and they confidently went with it and successfully made an idea of masculinity that is more compatible with the Western, with the Korean culture instead of the Western culture. They did not try to grow beards or try to bulk up like the Western counterparts. But I think that Indians still have not successfully done that. I mean, they're just trying to replace anything the Indian with their Western counterparts, so that they could, they believe that they truly believe that that's better than the Indian counterpart. So if you look at the Bollywood celebrities, the chances of finding somebody that looks exactly like those Bollywood celebrities in India, in the general population, is very slim. But my question is, when will Indian people be able to find an idea of masculinity that is more compatible with the general Indian population, just like what K-pop did to Korean people and Hollywood did to the Western society?
Right. Okay. Wow. Thank you so much for your question, Rishi, Alex. But unfortunately, let me point out that you are making several assumptions over here, and I'm not terribly sure if those assumptions should be made, because as somebody who has lived in America for 9 months. I can honestly tell you that American men, or the vast majority of American men, look nothing like Hollywood stars. Nothing. And they do not aspire to look like Hollywood stars. They do not regard Hollywood stars as their role model. They actually don't. So therefore, Hollywood to them is just entertainment. Hollywood is not to be emulated. Hollywood is not to be followed. So therefore, the vast majority of American men are simply not interested in whether or not they conform to the representation of masculinity that is coming down to them from cinema. Similarly, for Korea, I think what one really has to understand over there is the enormous popularity of K-pop and BTS in particular, is that you must understand that this is also to a certain extent a kind of packaging. It is a kind of a product, because of course you know that it is a product. A certain amount of objectification is going on there too. Not necessarily a rather wonderful one. Not necessarily a very bad one, but objectification nonetheless. That objectification is happening in order to cater to a vast teenage female heterosexual fan base who feel comfortable with that kind of masculinity, which is not so much adult masculinity, but a kind of boyish masculinity. So what we are looking at is therefore it is a kind of a boyishness. Yes, these are not so much men as boys. And it is the fact that they are, and of course, many of you would also be interested, though most of us are aware of K-pop, but not many of us are aware of a very sizable genre of entertainment which originates from Thailand, which is called BL. Now, BL stands for boy love. Now, what you have in these boy love, I would welcome you to Google them. What you have in boy love serials is that most often it's about two boys who are falling in love with each other, right? So these are all gay love stories. These are all about two boys who are falling in love with each other. But what is important to note over here is that all of these BL kind of web series that are available, you can find some of them on Netflix as well. They are not targeted to other gay men. They are targeted to heterosexual women. So it is the heterosexual women who are much more influential in dictating a certain representation of masculinity that that K-pop is producing and circulating, that BL fiction is producing and circulating. So those are the assumptions that maybe we need to question. As far as the Indian masculinity is concerned, I would actually disagree. I think that there are local masculinities that are perhaps much more representative of the cultural diversity that India has. Your point regarding the hegemonic power of Bollywood is, of course, entirely correct. It certainly tries to purvey a certain kind of masculinity, and I think this is where there is a major difference between the average American man and the average Indian man, because also most average Indian men, while they do not subscribe, I mean, they don't care what Hrithik Roshan, looks like, or what John Abraham looks like. But a sizable section of the youth, they certainly want to model themselves on Hrithik Roshan and all of that. And no, I mean, in Kolkata, we've just had the pujas. We just had Durga Puja. And this year, of course, Durga Puja was all sort of socially distanced and nobody went, I mean, very few people went out. But previously, Durga Pujas was a major occasion to showcase a kind of hegemonic masculinity. So young men would start going to the gym from April, May, in order to have enormous muscles to be able to look like Hrithik Roshan in October. So that is the answer to your question. I don't think India necessarily needs one kind of Indian masculinity, because that would be equally hegemonic. I think that India has got several regional masculinities, and I think those need to be celebrated. But thank you for a very important question.
So
Okay,
I
sir.
have a question, sir. Can I ask my question?
Yes, please, Divya. Yeah.
Yes, sir, since you mentioned about Bollywood and the masculinity there, especially with reference to John Abraham, I was just wondering whether, is there a kind of a shift in the way masculinity is performed these days? Because with the new crop of actors like, Ayushmann Khurrana, Rajkumar Rao, Vikrant Massey, so is there a kind of a change, or is it very desperate, that the OTT platform is actually giving a kind of a space to a new kind of a masculinity? So is there a change? I was really wondering about it and would really love to hear from you as to what you think about it.
I absolutely agree. I think that there is a change. I think that there is a certain kind of Indian viewership which is actually sick and tired of the way in which a kind of violent, muscular masculinity has been presented. The Indian viewer is really tired. So Indian viewer now wishes to see representations of masculinity that are not overtly heterosexual, that are not enormously muscled, that are not clearly violent. So I think Ayushmann Khurrana has got a very, very important cultural role to play, and I believe that he's doing that. But certainly people like Rajkumar Rao is fantastically important. You're absolutely right in noting that there is a change, but I think that this change is not it's not homogeneous. It isn't all inclusive. So just as there are going to be people like Rajkumar Rao and Ayushman Khurrana, there will still continue to be people like Tiger Shroff, who are still going to invoke and regurgitate a very, very tired notion of masculinity as being heavily muscled and capable of violence and sort of physically fit and all of that. So therefore, I think now we are, in a certain way, I'll be cautious about it. In a certain way, we are perhaps revisiting the 1970s, when there were several kinds of masculinity available. So in the 1970s, just as you had the violent, angry masculinity of Amitabh Bachchan, but you also had the sensitive masculinity of Sanjeev Kumar. And I think that maybe we are gradually going towards the point where there will be several kinds of masculinity that will be coexistent. And I think that that's a good thing. So yes, I completely agree with you, Divya. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. The question is thank you.
Sir, may I ask a question?
Yes, Hassan.
Okay, sir, this is fascinating lecture discussion. So, sir, you correctly mentioned that masculinity is associated with obviously mind and race. My question is, does masculinity associate with the caste and class? And I also want to know about this, the masculinity of Bhadralok and Chotolok in Bengali culture. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, oh, completely. I mean, I just mentioned race, but certainly caste, certainly class, certainly even religion become very, very important in the way in which masculinity is figured. And I'll just very quickly say that, when we are talking about caste, you see the way in which the Dalit male body is treated in a Brahminical society is very identical to the way in which women are treated in a Brahminical society. The way in which men of the lowered classes are treated in a Brahminical society is very, very similar to the way in which women are treated in a patriarchal society. So therefore, yes, absolutely, masculinity is not just, again, masculinity is overdetermined in the same way that femininity is overdetermined. So masculinity is, how is it overdetermined? It is determined through the forces of, I'm just naming a few variables, but there are more. So race, class, caste, religion, ethnicity, region, language. So therefore, all of these contribute towards the consolidation of masculinity. So yes, absolutely, caste and class play very important roles. Thank you so much, Hassan, for your question.
Sir.
May I ask a question?
Can I take Preeti's question first, and then I'll take Thomas's question. So Thomas, you're next in queue. So let me just take Preeti's question first. Yeah, Preeti.
So I was just interested because of what you said about boy love and K-pop and all that, and how it's going in popularity. I was interested particularly in this times of the pandemic, looking at the US. The whole idea of masculinity has come to the fore, so much so that, if you, including the president there and men, the whole idea of wearing a mask has become unmasculine. So are we going back to the situation where you have to have the idea of a man who's physically superior? That idea is also coming back, not just the idea of the sensitive kind of person.
Oh yes, oh absolutely. In fact, this has to be my third or fourth webinar presentation on masculinity. But this is the first one where I've actually used a PPT. So all this time I have not used a PPT. I have forwarded links of some of my previous lectures of masculinity that may have been circulated amongst you. So there are things that I said there that I didn't say here. So maybe you can watch those previous webinars and form a greater understanding of how masculinity studies works. The reason why I mentioned my previous seminars is that way back in June or July, I spoke at a webinar on masculinity, and I precisely mentioned Donald Trump. I precisely mentioned Donald Trump and his refusal to wear a mask. And many of us remembered that even after he eventually got COVID, and when he was released from hospital, we all remember that extraordinary image where he was standing on the balcony of the White House and he pulled off his mask in full public view. He pulled off his mask even when he was having, we could all see that he was having difficulty breathing, but even then he pulled off his mask. So when he's doing that, he is again doing that same thing. Who's saying that, what did he say? You remember what he said? He said, maybe I'm immune, which makes no sense at all, because if he were immune, then he wouldn't get the virus. So of course he's not immune, but he said, maybe I'm immune. This directly connects with the patriarchal configuration of masculinity as residing in the mind. So Donald Trump is basically saying, look, my body almost doesn't exist. My body doesn't exist because I'm a man, so I am all mind. So there is, and of course it is not coming back, Preeti. I think that it never went away. It never went away. I think the whole idea of men having the mind and women having the body is so tenacious. It is so so almost ineradicable that it just never goes away. It just continues to regurgitate in a rather alarming way. So that's what it is, Preeti. So thank you so much for your question. I will take Thomas's question now. Thank you so much. Thomas.
Oh, thank you, sir. So can masculinity be referred to in a positive sense? Because you have also mentioned about the Dalit masculinity being overshadowed by Brahmanical masculinity in the Indian context. And there has been a recent novel written by Malayalam author S. Harish called The Meesha or The Mustache. And it has been into a lot of controversy, especially the writer has had to face a lot of scathing remarks from the society. And he was by violence from the right-wing groups. And the story of a Dalit young man called Vavachan, and he's presented as a larger than life figure, and it can be it's kind of a folktale like narration. The novel is like a folktale narration, which is the folk songs are kind of a life soul of the Dalits. So
absolutely.
So can this masculinity be used as a means of resistance for the oppressed and the voiceless, not just in the gender discourses and such kinds of notions?
I think there are two problems in this, in the sense that first of all, I'm really, thank you so much. I would actually want to get more details about the novel because I don't know about it. So I would certainly want to know more about the novel, and maybe if you could tell me if the novel has been translated in English so that I can acquire a copy of it.
It is, I think it is.
It has been translated in English?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Published by HarperCollins.
It's been published. Oh, fantastic! That's very, very good. So if you can just pass on the information to me, I will certainly order it, and I would want to read it because it seems to me to be a fairly important novel. But that's not the point. The point is that you see, it's very one has to do this very carefully. It is one thing to say that I do not want to be dominated by any particular identity. That is a valid way to say that I do not want to be dominated by any kind of identity. But if I then go on to present myself in such a way that I have the capacity to become hegemonic myself, I have the capacity to be domineering myself, then ultimately the whole exercise becomes counterproductive. Because what you're basically saying is, I don't want to be dominated by you, but I will dominate others. So very often we see this this kind of hypocrisy, or this kind of cognitive dissonance is something that we see very, very commonly, right, amongst many of us. So I, for example, as a cis man, I can say, I refuse to be, as a Bengali man, right? I can say that I refuse to be dominated by Hindi hegemony that is coming from the North India. So then that is going to be my resistance to the domination of Hindi hegemony that is coming from North India. But I am then going to tell people from Bihar, or people from Odisha, or people from Assam, that you should all read Bengali, because Bengali is the best language that there is. So that is where it becomes very complicated. Is on the one hand, I am saying I'm not going to be dominated by you, but on the other hand, I'm happily saying, yes, but you should be dominated by me. So I would want all of us to be a little careful, because let us resist dominance, but let us also at the same time be careful lest we become dominant ourselves. But I think that yes, of course, Dalit resistance is necessary, but one should be very careful to see how that resistance is happening. I think that is the most important point. But Thomas, please do give me more details about the novel. You can take my WhatsApp number from Febu, and you can certainly message me. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, sir.
Sorry, can we have one more question?
Yes, of course you can have one more question. Yes.
Okay, so I'll just read out a question that has come up in the chat box.
Yes.
Fairy tales, cartoons, myths, etc. have masculinity, femininity, and androgyny that mold a child's mind into the so-called gender roles the society expects of them. Though a lot of the breakthroughs are happening in the field, why is this being repeated on? What can we do to break this cycle? This is a question from a PG student, Aroma Meru.
Oh God. Yeah. No, I completely share your concern. I completely share your concern. It is dangerous. I am upset that this continues to happen. But you know why this is happening. It is happening, you should know that this is happening because patriarchy to a certain extent is feeling threatened. Patriarchy is feeling threatened by the enormous advances that feminism is making. Patriarchy is extremely upset and worried and scared by the advances that are being made by LGBT studies, by queer theory, by masculinity studies, by disability studies. So patriarchy feels that it is under attack. And these kind of noxious patriarchal narratives are still being churned out in order to shore up the power base that patriarchy has enjoyed all this time, but now it feels that power is perhaps slipping away. And in order to do that, in order to consolidate power, these extremely dangerous, poisonous patriarchal narratives are being circulated. So please be on guard. These narratives will continue to be circulated, but we are also continue to resist them. We are also going to continue to produce our own feminist, queer, complicated, challenging narratives.
Thank you, sir. Another question that has, many questions have come up actually. I'll read another one. And how many questions would you like to have, sir? Like one or two more?
I can only have about 500 more questions.
Sure. I think there are so much in the chat box. Okay. Okay. Another question that has come up is from
I had cleared this morning because I knew this was going to happen.
Yes. Yeah. So, yeah, another question that has come up is what about the emergence of Hindutva masculinity? Again, it is by Anupam. Would you like to answer that?
Yes, I know it is. It is. Well, I mean, I think this is going to be a very short answer. I am concerned about it, and it is becoming more and more dangerous, and it is dangerous for the nation. And I believe that it should be resisted through whichever means possible. But it is concerning. It is very, very concerning.
Yes, thank you for that answer, sir. Another question that has come up again is masculinity always has a hegemonic nature. How do we define this in a male-only environment? Like, for example, a male prison. How does it affect the male mind?
Correct. I think that I did not talk very much about the theorization of masculinity that has been done by Raywin Connell. Raywin Connell actually divides masculinity into 3 different tiers. So on the top tier, you've got hegemonic masculinity. In the middle tier, you've got complicit masculinity. And in the 3rd tier, you've got subordinate masculinity. So therefore, all masculinities are not equally dominant. There are some masculinities that are more dominant than others. And so therefore, the very important contribution that masculinity studies makes is to say that all men are not oppressors. Some are also oppressed by other men. So therefore, in prisons, why only talk about prisons? In sort of men's only colleges, in engineering colleges, right? In engineering colleges, in sort of technological colleges, in the hostels, in men's only hostels, in boys' hostels, there is tremendous oppression, and you will know this that many students have either had to discontinue studies at a particular institution, or in 1 or 2 cases, they have more than 1 or 2 cases, they have committed suicide because they were unable to take the kind of harassment and bullying that was visited on them, not by other women, but by other men. So therefore, not all masculinities are oppressive. There are masculinities that are oppressed. And I think that we need to therefore try and understand that masculinity is not one uniform block, that there are several gradations in it. And that is something that we have to keep in mind. So thank you for your question.
That question was by Nala. Another question by Anju John. She initially thanks for the enlightening session. And her question is, when it comes to masculinity being represented in films, can you explain about the patriarchal father-son American masculinity represented in 1970s?
I actually have to say that I haven't looked into that in great detail, because that seems to be a very specific area. Sort of American movies in the 1970s. I haven't actually looked into that area, but what I will say is that the father-son relationship is a remarkably interesting area, because very often, there is a lot of romanticization, a lot of sentimentalization of the relationship between the father and the daughter, or between the mother and the son. But not so much regarding the relationship between the father and the daughter, the son. I think a very important kind of film that I would want to reference over here is a film in which I think a South Indian actor took part in it. It's called Dear Dad. I think it is available on Netflix. I would certainly want you to watch that film called Dear Dad. If somebody knows the name of this particular actor, because it's just sort of, I'm forgetting the name of this particular actor. I think the name of the film is called Dear Dad. There, I think it is very interesting how the relationship between the father and the son operates. So I think you can look, because this is primarily an English department, what you can do as students of the English department is look at texts where there are representations of father-son relationships and try to find out how patriarchy is working between these two men. Are they equal? Are they friends? Is one oppressing the other? So all of these very interesting questions can come up if you look at the relationships that exist between fathers and sons in texts across disciplines. But I'm so sorry that I don't have a specific answer to American movies in the 1970s. So that looks like a research topic, but thank you.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, sir, for that answer. One more question here in the chat box. That is, can you please comment on drag queen performances in American gay bars of the 1960s? The question by Susanna Thomas.
Right. Not only in the 1960s, I actually do not know much about the drag queens performances in the 1960s because there isn't much video footage available. Of course, we have many documents. So we certainly have a lot of documentation of the way in which drag queens performed in the 1960s at gay bars. But I can certainly talk about the way in which drag queens have actually, in a major way, I'm sorry, entered popular culture, primarily through the intervention of persons like drag queens like RuPaul. So many of you may be aware of RuPaul's Drag Race, which of course is very widely watched. It was initially an American series, reality TV. And then, of course, now it has been also exported to England and to other countries. So, so my broad answer to the question of drag queens is that drag queens are, whether consciously or unconsciously, but I think mostly consciously, this is a very political act, because when you are actually performing drag, what you are doing is, and this is something that, again, something that I'm taking from Judith Butler, so I claim no credit for saying this, but what drag queens do is to basically expose once and for all the truth that gender is performative. That, I think, is the crucial intervention that drag queens make, is that your gender is not that which you are born with. Your gender is, I mean, you're not born with any gender, of course. Your gender is not the one that has been dumped on you by your loving family, by your loving parents, but your gender is what you wish to claim for yourself. So what drag queens do, and much more importantly, what drag kings do, drag kings are not very often talked about, that is to say, male impersonators who are originally women. Drag kings are not talked about, but they do the same thing. But what drag queens do is to basically say that while gender is performative, one need not perform the gender that society expects you to. One can certainly take control of gender, and one can mold gender to what you would wish it to be. And I think that I would particularly want you to Google one particular, I don't know whether I would actually call that person a drag queen or not, but I think the person's performance is very interesting. The person is Austrian, and the name is Conchita Wurst. So please Google videos, please Google images of Conchita Wurst, Conchita Wurst, that is Wurst. I think what Conchita Wurst does through visual presentation, through performance, is to complicate again the performance of masculinity, because Conchita Wurst can wear a very, very beautiful, elaborate gown, but Conchita Wurst has a beard. So Conchita Wurst has a full black, and a lot of but those who understand Conchita Wurst realize that she is that they are doing a very important intervention in the performance of drag. So do look up Conchita Wurst. I think she'll be wonderful. But also look up RuPaul's Drag Race. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, sir, for that answer. I think the movie that you have asked before, Dear Dad, by I think the actress Arvind Swamy, because someone has mentioned that in the
Arvind
chat
Swamy,
box.
exactly. Arvind Swamy. Correct.
Okay.
Arvind Swamy. Yes.
A question by Anupam Devnath. Is Cure Masculinity Beyond
Yes.
Oppressed complex?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that question.
Is Cure Masculinity Beyond Oppressed complex by Anupam Devnath?
Is Cure?
Yeah, Cure Masculinity.
What is Cure Masculinity? Maybe that is something that maybe I'm not aware of it. So I'll look into that. So I'll look into what is Cure Masculinity. Yeah.
Okay. Anyone from the audience, if you want to ask the question?
Shall I ask one question? Yeah, Niladri sir.
No, Febu, you're not allowed to ask a question.
No, this is on behalf of students.
I will not ask.
This is on behalf of students.
Of course, you can ask a question.
Basic question.
Yes.
Is there any difference between feminism and masculinity studies? Masculinity studies.
No, there isn't. I think that's a very basic question. And I think that it's an important question because I think it should be addressed. The politics of masculinity studies is completely feminist. Completely feminist. Because masculinity studies is inspired by feminism. And this is something which a lot of people actually do not realize, because when very often when I say that I'm going to talk about masculinity studies, some men get very excited and they say, yeah, I mean, now people should talk about the men. And I say, well, I don't think I'm going to talk about the men the way in which you want me to talk about the men. I'm so sorry. I'm going to disappoint you. Because I'm not going to talk about the men the way in which men's rights organizations talk about the men, which is, kill the women. I am not going to talk about it like that. What people actually very often fail to understand is that masculinity studies is feminist. That is something which a lot of people have problems understanding, because masculinity studies believes that masculinity is constructed the same way that femininity is constructed. So masculinity studies is actually inspired by feminism, and a lot of the theoretical energy that informs masculinity studies is derived from feminism. So at the very base, at its origin, masculinity studies is feminist, and masculinity studies continues to be feminist. The only difference between masculinity studies and feminism is that feminism started off assuming that one feminism fits all. But when masculinity studies came to form itself, at the very beginning, there was already an acknowledgement that one kind of theorization of masculinity may not fit all. So therefore, what we then have is several theorizations of masculinity that begin to happen, right? So therefore, you have protest masculinity. You've got salaryman masculinity, which was very, very beautifully theorized by Rohit Dasgupta, I think. Romit Dasgupta, sorry. By Romit Dasgupta in his work on Japanese masculinity, so the salaryman masculinity. So there are various, so I'm sure that there are, Mrinalini Sinha, for example, has done work on post-colonial Indian masculinity. So therefore, the Babu masculinity has been worked on by Indira Chaudhary. So I think that masculinity studies has, right at its inception, realized that one kind of theorization of masculinity is not going to fit all. Feminism also came to that position a little later, because feminism also believed that one feminism is not going to fit all. So that, but masculinity studies is primarily feminist. Thank you, Phoebe.
Thank you, sir.
Anyone from the audience?
Can I ask one more
Listeners,
question?
anyone? Yeah, sure, you can.
So I just have one more question.
Yes.
You just mentioned about Indian masculinity. So is there something called as Indian masculinity with the kind of, the different regions and cultures that we have? Is it possible to say something like that? Like there is an Indian masculinity?
No, there isn't, exactly. So I'm sorry I didn't get to do my air quotes when I said that. So here goes, Indian masculinity. So of course, Indian masculinity doesn't exist. I don't even know what Indian culture is. I don't even know what Indian is. I know that I have an Indian passport. That I know. I know that I have an Indian passport. But if you ask me, how are you Indian? I will not be able to say. I will not be able to say how I'm an Indian. So yes, there is no one Indian masculinity. There are several, one can say that there are several regional masculinities. And I think, which is why I said that it is perhaps not necessary to have one Indian masculinity. Perhaps, all the various kind of regional masculinities can continue to share space. So I think that would be far more enriching than to uphold one kind of Indian masculinity, because Divya, my worry is that very often when we talk about India, by default we talk about North India. And that is my real problem over here, is that we say India, but in our heads we are thinking North India. So therefore, maybe that is something that we absolutely need to get rid of. So yes, there is no one Indian masculinity, and I hope there never is one.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
So I can see that the seminar has, the webinar has gone on for 2 hours now.
Yeah, and I guess no one is getting tired here. So would you want to have one more question? Or?
Sure, yes. No, that's fine. That's fine.
It's fine. Okay. There is a question in the chat box. Just read it out for you. And that is, what is the psychology behind performing masculinity? If there's any criteria that define masculinity, does it vary across space and temporality?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So I'll answer your second question first. Yes, masculinity is chronotopic, to use Bakhtin's theorization. So yes, masculinity differs from place to place. Masculinity differs from time to time. So that is just to answer your second question. But the first question, I think, is a little bit more complex. What is the psychology behind performance of masculinity? I think that in vast majority of cases, there are two things that happen. One is that certain performances are designated as masculine, whereas when the person who is performing it need not recognize it as being masculine at all. So say, for example, when somebody who is designated female at birth when the pronoun that I'll use for that person is going to be she. So when she, from a very young age, says that, I enjoy playing football, and I enjoy climbing trees, and I enjoy running around the neighborhood with other boys, people are going to say, oh, you are behaving like a boy. But she's not behaving like a boy. She is simply behaving like herself. It is that the society has decided that she's behaving like a boy, which is not the same thing as saying that she's behaving like a boy. So on the one hand, we ascribe a kind of masculinity when the person performing it may not necessarily recognize it as being masculine. That is the one point. The second point is that in order to access patriarchal privileges, in order to access patriarchal dividends, many of us actually train ourselves to perform masculinity. Because this is where I will have to talk about my cousin. Because when I asked him on one occasion, I myself don't smoke and I don't drink. I can't ride a bicycle and I cannot whistle. So there you see, you look at me and you think, sir, excuse me, but what kind of a man are you? You don't smoke, you don't drink, you can't ride a bicycle, and you cannot whistle, sir. I don't think you're a man, sir. So therefore, what I asked my cousin, why do you smoke? Why do you smoke? Because medical research till date has not shown us any great health benefits of smoking. So why do you smoke? And he said very, very honestly, and I'll never forget that answer. He said, I smoke in order to feel like a man. I said, okay. Okay. No more questions. If you have today told me in so many words, I smoke to become a man, do you realize how delicate and how unstable masculinity is, that it can be accessed through one cigarette? One cigarette gives you masculinity. So therefore, so the answer is that obviously I believe that masculinity is unstable, and people access masculinity to people perform masculinity to access patriarchal privilege, but there are these other persons who perform themselves, but society recognizes their behavior, or society designates their behavior as masculine. So those are the things that we have to perhaps keep in mind. Thank you.
Thank you. That question was by Alicia, a PG student from a college.
Hello, ma'am.
Hello?
Yes. Yes, Alicia.
Sir, can I ask one more question, please?
Yes, if you promise to be very good.
Oh, that I don't know, that you'll have to decide. Anyways, when you told about the story behind your brother, that cigarette can be defined as a criteria.
Yes.
So just then something popped into my mind, like,
yes,
is molestation or any kind of assault can be considered as a medium of performing masculinity?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that there is no doubt about it at all. I am tired, Alicia, I am tired of telling people that rape is not an act of lust. I am tired of telling this to people. Rape is not an act of lust. Rape is a performance of power. And it is the performance of patriarchal power. That is what rape is. Rape has got nothing to do with sexual desire. Nothing. It has got everything to do with the way in which you think you need to show your patriarchal power. So yes, molestation is absolutely the enactment of not just masculinity, it is the enactment of toxic masculinity. So not all masculinities are toxic. I don't think Ayushmann Khurrana's masculinity is toxic. I don't think Rajkumar Rao's masculinity is toxic, but I certainly think that the masculinity of, say, Kabir Singh, that horrible movie, that it's.
I was about to ask you that.
It's. I mean, you know, I have heard so much about Kabir Singh that I don't want to watch that movie. Because I think that if I start watching that movie, I'll probably destroy my laptop or I'll kill someone. So I do not want to watch Kabir Singh. It's a horrible film. And I'm saying this even without having watched it, because I know what is shown in that film. So I think that so molestation, rape, sexual harassment, these are absolute performances of toxic masculinity. Yes, it is.
So, sir, I guess the kind of punishments that we give in India for such kind of crimes is not a proper way of addressing that.
Not at all.
Yeah. So what can be done? What can be done?
I think that a lot of counseling is necessary. I think that it is counseling. I think people should reach out to them. They have to be spoken to. I am not guaranteeing that it will work. It may work for some, it may not work for others. I am not, prescribing it as one sure treatment. But I think counseling is very necessary. I think that people who behave in this kind of behavior, they must be spoken to. Nobody is born evil, Alisha. Nobody is born evil. Nobody is born a molester. Nobody is born a rapist. So then how do they become that? Because the society gives them certain messages and they imbibe those messages and they say, okay, I have to do this in order to show my power. So I think that more discussion is required. I think there should be more workshops that should be carried out. And much more importantly, I think that workshops are a big undertaking. They need to be done at an institutional level. But I think what we can do is in our own families, we should perhaps talk to our fathers and our brothers and our male cousins. And if they say something that seems to be toxic masculine, we should perhaps talk to them. And we should say, excuse me, I don't think that is something that you should say, because, and then you explain to them that, look, what you just said is perhaps inappropriate because there's a problem there. So I think that we need to have discussions within the family, and we also need to have discussions with our colleagues, with our friends, and I think, and then the discussions can broaden out, so that other people can gradually be included. But sort of punishment is not the solution, Alisha. Punishment is never the solution. Punishment was never the solution. Counseling is the solution.
Okay, sir. So one more question. Please bear me.
You're very greedy.
Yeah, sort of. Sir, what is your opinion about the dressing of women? Like, I happened to watch a bite of a TV program. I think it's MTV Traffic Police something. So one man was saying that the major kind of provocation for people to cyberbully women or models is the way they dress. So the exact phrase that he used was "zyada kuch nahi dikhna chahiye." This was the phrase that he used. So I was like, what is this man saying? So what is your opinion about that kind of dumb person? What can we do? Can counseling do a benefit to their thinking or perception?
Yeah, so first of all, this is my opinion about what the man said.
Yeah.
So that should be clear. But also, you see, the problem, Alisha, is that they have been cultured in patriarchy to such an extent that at this point in their lives, they may not be amenable to change. So unfortunately, there will be some men who will not change, who will continue to behave like this, and there is nothing that we can do about it. However, we should certainly try to talk to them. If it doesn't work, well, it doesn't work. But I think much more important, Alisha, is schools.
Yeah.
We should target children in schools. So many of you who are students today, tomorrow you're going to teach at a school, tomorrow you're going to teach at a college. This is where you stand to make a very, very important contribution, because you see, gendering begins in school. Well, I mean, it also begins in the family. It also begins in the family, but it also begins it is sort of, it is helped by the gendering in schools. So I think we need more feminist teachers. We need more feminist teachers who are going to, check these young boys and girls when they're behaving in a patriarchal way. We should tell them, listen, don't do that. Don't do that. That is something that you should not do. And then you also explain to them. Don't just say, don't do that. You also explain to them. I think the best thing that we as feminists can do is to constantly encourage friendship between and amongst the sexes.
Yes, true.
Friendship is the best solution. Become friends, because the moment you foster friendship, they will begin to realize that sexes other than theirs are not people from a different planet. They are human beings like us. So my solution would be friendship. Foster friendship from nursery, from KG, from class 1. That is where the problem begins.
Yes, thank you so much, sir. That was really awesome session, and I was really looking forward to this section since I have already watched another lecture of yours. Thank you so much.
You watched my YouTube videos?
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank
It was
you,
a pleasure
Alisha.
interacting with you.
Well, it was a joy. It was a joy being here.
Thank you, sir. I think we'll, sort of forcefully stop this interactive session, because I think but then one thing
after it has gone on for 2.5 hours.
What I would want to add to this is, like, as you said, gendering starts in the family. I think it starts even before that. When a child is born in a population.
I agree. I completely agree. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
That the doctor tells the mother it's a boy, it's a girl. I think it starts there.
Yeah. Why do that? Why do that? That is unnecessary. I completely agree with you. Why not say you have a child?
Yeah, so
Hello, Mr. Asham's voice on.
Somebody has switched on the. Yeah. So okay. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think now I'll invite Dr. Asha Susie Jacob. She's the IQAC coordinator of our college, and she also happens to be the senior most teacher of our the faculty of. So she will be giving you a word of thanks. So welcome, ma'am.
Honorable guest of the day, Professor Dr. Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee. Srimati Elizabeth John, head of the department. Invited guests, dear friends and colleagues. Good afternoon. We have come to the end of the fruitful lecture on performing masculinity by Professor Dr. Niladri Ranjan Chatterjee, Department of English, University of Kalyani, West Bengal. It was indeed a remarkably brilliant and lucid presentation on how masculinity is represented. On behalf of the Postgraduate and Research Department of English, the English Association, and the IQAC of St. Thomas College, Koyanjeri, I extend to you, sir, our sincere gratitude. I appreciate the way you explain the nuances of masculinity and how you responded to the queries. A big salute and a big thank you to you, sir. We also place on record our gratitude to Dr. Matthew P. John, our principal, for all his support and encouragement, and also for gracing the occasion with his presence and his speech. Now we acknowledge our sincere thanks to all the participants, both faculty and students from various institutions who have joined us today and made this a very vibrant session. Finally, I would like to express my appreciation of the English team to which I also belong. Under the guidance of Srimati Elizabeth John as head of the department, Dr. Tina Rachel Thomas and Prabhu George Mathai as conveners, and the ever enthusiastic students of the department for organizing such a wonderful webinar. Before I conclude, I lift up my hands to the Almighty for being with us, guiding us. As I sign out, on behalf of the Department of English and the IQAC, I thank you all once again for all your cordial cooperation, pleasant presence, and participation. Thank you. Have a nice day.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And
yes, I wish you all a safe time, and I hope that someday I will be able to meet all of you in person.
That would be wonderful, sir. I hope that happens soon. Yes, so thank you so much. And that is officially the end of the National Invited Talk. Thank you so much for being with us.